DeLesslin Ye sware, ye Catawba Tatena bak, yaksuna wanda, namina mark, imbarana eden, hakchu Hawo Manu, Hawo Nitem, Hawo Iswan, Hawo Nungti, Hawo. Hi everyone, my name is DeLesslin George-Warren, but everyone just calls me Roo, like kangaroo. I'm a citizen of Catawba Nation, and we are the people of the river. Thanks to the land, thanks to the river, thanks to the sun, and thank you to you. I'm grateful that we could come together in this way, you from wherever you are, and me calling from the Catawba Reservation. Gathering implies inclusion, which may also hint at exclusion. And it's true that Indigenous peoples continue to be excluded from STEAM fields, from equitable financial institutions, from clean water, from clean air, and even from our own lands. Even when an Indigenous person clears a path into the highest, most exclusive institutions, the experience is usually one of impending exclusion.
The Honourable Member for St. John's.
Miigwech, Madam Speaker. Jana Williams, a beautiful young woman and a mother to 2 young girls and pregnant with her third, Madam Speaker, was found murdered last week. Let me confirm for the House that Jana is loved by her family. Her family is absolutely devastated. Jana deserves to be honored. Jana deserves justice, Madam Speaker. Will the minister, after nearly 2 years, finally prioritize the implementation of the recommendations of the National Inquiry's final report?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Madam Speaker, let me begin by saying that Manitobans are devastated by the loss of this woman. We know that there was a vigil that was recently held and that was well attended. We know that there's an investigation underway right now, and we are all waiting expectantly for the results of that investigation because we want someone to be held accountable for the loss of life of this woman.
The Honourable Member for St. John's on a supplementary question.
Miigwech, Madam Speaker, and yet we haven't heard a peep from any single member of the PC caucus in respect of condolences to the families. We didn't see them there at the vigil. We know that nobody's reached out to the family. That's shameful, Madam Speaker. And here we are 2 years after the National Inquiry's calls to justice, and we've seen no action from this government. Why? Why have we not seen any action from this government? Because they simply don't care, Madam Speaker. What we know is that the budget for the Family Information Liaison Office has been discontinued, and I table our FIPA confirming that these funds, which are critical for engagements of families, have been discontinued. Why is the Pallister government not prioritizing MMIWG to us?
The Honourable First Minister.
Congratulate the member on attending the vigil the other night, and I know that she spoke well in the TV clip I saw, and I appreciate her efforts in that respect, but I think it's shameless political behavior to try to cast aspersions at people who weren't at the vigil along with her and the few dozen people who were there. I admire her effort in respect of this, but I don't think it's right to try to score political points using the death of a Manitoban as a lever.
The Honourable Member for St. John's on a final supplementary.
Madam Speaker, I'm not trying to score political points. I'm simply Order. Order.
Answer a question sometimes.
Order. The Honourable Member for St. John's.
The Minister of Justice is yelling at members over here on the opposite side, saying that it's disgraceful. Madam Speaker, I'm simply pointing out that not one single member of the PC caucus has reached out to the family or has even posted on Twitter, which they are so apt to do when it's Orange Shirt Day, condolences to the family. It is indicative that they just don't give a crap about Indigenous women and girls in this province.
Order. I think the member probably knows full well that the language she was using is unparliamentary in the House, and I'm going to ask her to withdraw that statement. The honourable member for St. John's.
I will not.
I'm going to ask the member again in this House. That was unparliamentary language. Most times when people are asked to withdraw unparliamentary language, it is something that they are most willing to do. Sometimes we get caught up in the passion of something. I'm going to give the member another chance to withdraw those comments and conclude her question. The honourable member for St. John's.
There's a slaughter of Indigenous women, and I will not.
Order.
I will not withdraw my comments.
I will give the member one more chance out of courtesy to give some further important thought to that and ask the member one more time if she would be willing to withdraw her unparliamentary comment. The honourable member for St. John's.
I will not.
Member has been given 3 chances to withdraw her comments. And I have requested, directed, instructed the member to do that. I have no alternative now to name the member for St. John's, the honourable member for St. John's, pursuant to our rules for. Well, I have no alternative but to name Nahanni Fontaine, the honourable member for St. John's, pursuant to our rules for disregarding the authority of the chair, and to direct that she withdraw from the chamber for the remainder of this sitting day.
This expulsion of Nahanni Fontaine, an elected politician in the Manitoba Parliament and one of the few Indigenous people in positions of power in so-called Canada, happened just a few weeks after Rawiri Waititi, who is here, was expelled from the New Zealand Parliament for wearing haitiki. There. A tradition that predates the establishment of the New Zealand Parliament by millennia. The reason? He wasn't wearing a necktie, or as Waititi iconically dubbed it, a colonial noose. So in honor of Rawiri Waititi's powerful refusal and Nahanni Fontaine's adamant chorus of I will not, I will not, I will not, I thought the best way to start this would be with a little impropriety. So let's talk about crap. In preparing this piece, I decided to take a trip to Cherokee territory near Asheville, North Carolina. One of the first things I realized at the campsite that I was staying at, which was alongside this kind of smallish mountain, was that there were only composting toilets available. This wasn't my first time. My first time using a compost toilet was actually at the top of a mountain in Puerto Rico during March 2013. Being from the Southeast, I thought I knew what humidity was until I traveled to Patillas, Puerto Rico. There, the humidity combined with the water from like the flushing toilets made them very unappealing. And so I actually was preferring to use these compost toilets. And I was expecting like a horrible kind of outhouse smell and was shocked to have this smell of like pine shavings. while I was in Patillas, the site manager there showed us the process in which they would take what they called deposits, and that's their word for crap, were taken to a composting bin, and over a year and a half, that was turned into literal soil. I remember being really shocked when she reached her hand into the completed pile of human compost that had turned into soil and held it out for us to smell. We were all shocked and afraid to smell it, except for one person in my group who was very brave, who smelled it first, and then we all smelled, and it just smelled like dirt. And it was this amazing moment of realizing, oh my gosh, this is where soil comes from. This is where dirt comes from. So here in the woods, 2 hours after being on the road for 2 hours, I enthusiastically made use of that compost toilet at the campsite. And the instructions there were very similar to the ones in Patillas. Number 1, make a deposit. Number 2, take a scoop of wood shavings, placed conveniently near the toilet, and dump it into the toilet. Part 3, brush away the shavings and have a nice day. After my previous experiences with composting toilets, this seemed absolutely mundane to me, but I still remembered my immediate thought upon first hearing about composting toilets in Patillas. As I made my thinking about like, this is not how we use toilets. You have to have water. The crap has to go far away and we're not supposed to touch it or think about it ever again. And so as I made my deposit in the mountains, I contemplated what we do and don't say about crap. So here are some quick crap facts. Number 1, fossilized poop is called coprolite, unless it's human, in which case it's called paleofeces. Great names. The oldest coprolite that we've found is approximately 480 million years old. The oldest paleofeces is about 50,000 years old. So poop is quite old. And the other thing I learned is that we poop quite a lot. In typical, we poop about 14 to 17 ounces per day. There's about 328.2 million people in the United States. So there's about 508 million ounces of poop per day. That's about 31 million pounds per day, which equals about 15,887,000 tons of crap per day, which translate into 5,798,937.5 tons of crap per year. And that could all be turned into 44,941,765.5 tons of compost per year. And according to the EPA, a max of 24 million tons of fertilizer is sold per year in the US. So how might we use crap a little bit more efficiently? Now, in reality, many sewer processors in the US do use įhehęň to create fertilizer and compost after this kind of long process. I have no specific policy positions about poop, except that we should talk about it more. And to make that easier, I decided to write a song, and please feel free to teach it to everyone that you know. Take a breath, push it out. It is what we are all about. Close the door, keep it hidden, as if the act itself was forbidden. No matter what we do, no matter what we say, we can't hide the truth away. Crap makes the world go round. Crap makes the world go round. Even if we don't think we need it, think about it. Without it, we'd all be dead, dead, dead. Crap makes the world go round. Feeding worms, fungus too. Beetles also like the poo. Soil enriching, nitrogen building, hidden away. Crap makes the world go round. Crap makes the world go round. Even if we don't think we need it, think about it. Without it, we'd all be dead. Dead, dead. Crap makes the world go round. Across the clearing in the campsite that I was staying in, hinu, I see a mighty black walnut, but likely pretty young as far as walnuts go. From here, I can't see what is growing beneath the walnut, but I can guess what isn't growing. If I walked across the clearing, across the border, I'd probably not find lilac, rhododendron, or azalea, which makes me think that free markets and free competition don't exist. Walnuts are masters of regulating the local economy. Euglins nigra and other related species produce a compound called juglone, which is not juggalos, it is juglone over here. Juglone, which makes the soil toxic for certain plants. A beautiful seed gently planted underneath a black walnut will not sprout at all. Or if a seed does pull itself up by its bootstraps, perhaps there was more rain that season and it kept the juglone at bay, that seedling may die soon after. Or perhaps it'll grow, but in an atypical kind of way. Juglone can be found in all parts of the plant, including the thick husk that surrounds the shell, which in turn surrounds the seed that we know of as walnuts that we're used to cracking. Black walnut husks are actually kind of this thick, fleshy thing around the actual husk of the seed, and they make a really, really good dye. Actually, if you go on Etsy, you can find black walnut ink being sold at very high prices, and it makes this rich, dark brown, almost black. If you want to get in on this Etsy game and start making black walnut ink, my only advice to you is to beware and not get it anywhere near your eyes. One time I was processing some, touched my eyes, and they were burning for at least 5 hours afterwards. But even the young saplings of walnuts, way before they can produce these husks, are capable of introducing juglone into the surrounding soil through its roots and fallen leaves. Walnuts tip the local soil and water market in their favor, but not all plants mind. Some see the market opening created by the walnut's monopolistic strategy and are able to leverage their assets, namely their tolerance to juglone, to occupy a share of that market. But of course, the market can only reveal so much about these plant relationships because it is such a woefully limited metaphor. This limitation comes about because of a cultural insistence that competition is the central structuring logic of a free-flowing resource allocation. Now, a little caveat, I'm not an economist. If you are an economist who wants to tell me why I'm wrong, please send an email to spam@DeLesslin.com. That's spam@DELESSLIN.com, and tell me why I'm wrong. So competing for resources does absolutely exist, right? That's definitely a thing that exists. We are alive, and so we must consume. It's an unbreakable bond between us and the rest of the world. But as Dr. Kim Tallbear said on the podcast Media Indigena, it's not eat or be eaten, it's eat and be eaten. The walnut does compete aggressively, but it is not a tree unto itself. It relies on the actions of many tiny worms and crawly things and creepy things, and all of the stuff that feeds those creatures, like leaves and corpses, and of course, crap. But perhaps if we return to the market metaphor, we could say that to the walnut, its rich soil and all of the creatures that make it so are simply resources. But what does the tree do with these resources? It uses the nutrients in the soil, the water, and the sunshine for lots of things, like sugar. But unlike our model right now, the trees don't hoard those resources.
Underneath the soil, a vast and interconnected network of life links the trees through their root systems. But they can't talk to each other without help. The whole process starts with hub trees, the oldest and tallest trees in the forest. Hub trees have greater access to sunlight, and through the process of photosynthesis, end up producing more sugar than they actually need. Underground, fungi need sugar to survive. Most of their bodies are made up of a mass of threads called mycelium. They grow within the root system of trees to absorb the excess sugar. In return, the mycelium provides the tree with the nutrients it needs from the soil. This symbiotic relationship is known as mycorrhiza, which stems from the Greek words for fungus and root. These tree-fungi relationships connect the trees in the forest together, forming an underground communication network to exchange water and nutrients, to nurture their seedlings, and even send warning signals when under threat.
Instead of hoarding resources, these large established hub trees, which have the most access to water that's deep, deep, deep beneath the earth, the sun that is higher than all the other trees, they don't hoard them. They actually redistribute these resources to other trees through the action of their fungal partners. This is in stark contrast to our current human system of resource distribution, where hoarding is incentivized. Anishinaabe economist and activist Winona LaDuke has drawn on her people's traditions to name this a Wendigo economy, one that hungers and consumes and eats and is never satisfied, like a fire through the landscape. But large, healthy forests can actually be quite good at surviving these fires. In fact, may have evolved to survive these fires. But they don't survive the recent human practice of clear cutting. For example, take a look at this aerial time lapse of the relentless clear cutting in Oregon. We see just constantly moving through the landscape, removing trees. And on the ground, the effect is dramatic. Sometimes these clear cuts are followed by the planting of many quick growing saplings. Around here, for example, down in Catawba land, in what is the so-called Carolinas, we typically plant pines after a clear cutting, but although these trees will grow and become quite tall, they usually don't become a forest before they are cut again. They don't become a forest. A group of trees don't become a forest. Instead, they become something else, a collection of trees for sure, but they don't have the network of sharing of mycorrhizae, of the sharing between these elder established trees and the younger ones. And without these elder trees supporting the young ones and teaching them the ways of the roots and the fire and the people. From where I stand in the campsite, the flames look quite small, definitely from this altitude. Even just 6 feet off the ground, the flames are practically invisible in the late afternoon sun. It was the first thing I did at the campsite after unpacking my car and making use of that composting toilet. I didn't need a big fire, just one large enough to cook a weenie. I survived those 3 days on weenies and s'mores. So I go and I gather small twigs up, gathering them, some leaves, some needles, all the way up to this apparent property line. I stood right at the edge of the small pine barren that my campsite was in. It was likely that that pine barren was the result of an agricultural area or a pasture area that was left fallow for probably about the last 50 years. On the other side of this boundary that I'm standing at, everything has been cleared by a very large cat backhoe. The Airbnb that I'm staying at, their small resident cat, Kiki, is actually creeping in the field behind me as I'm standing on this border. About 15 feet on the other side of this border stood a single tree with a pink tag, which apparently was a tag that meant get out of being chopped down card. It's close enough that I could probably walk over and touch the tree before any of the people on that side notice me. But I'm tired, and that little stroll would probably be a crime. The tree looks like a young persimmon, possibly, but I can't be certain because I'm terrible at identifying trees when they don't have leaves on them. But the clearing on that side was recent, actually still ongoing. The hum of the cat was reminding me. But the impact on this side would be significant as spring approached. Shrubs and sun-loving plants would quickly take over the edge of that little pine barren, delicate ephemerals who need the shade, were protected by the trees that were in that place that was now cleared. They would likely burn this upcoming season from the unmitigated sunlight. It's here in my journal that my notes trail off, and I just write in big bold letters, "I am so burnt. I am so white," which I think was in response to me getting a pretty gnarly sunburn on my left arm and left knee during my relatively short drive to my Airbnb. This, of course, sent me on an anxiety spiral about melanoma and skin damage, which in turn made me pull off the highway and purchase sunscreen at the first place that had it, which was the third grocery store I went to. As I was waiting line at that gas station I came to, I tried to recall if there was a history of skin cancer in my family. And the only relevant detail I could find was that my grandmother had to have a bundle of abnormal cells actually removed from her nose. But that wasn't actually from sun exposure. Her doctors, when she was a teenager, actually used an experimental treatment in which they shone X-rays and other ultraviolet lights directly at her skin. The treatment was for acne. It's amazing how things change. So I pile up the dried pine needles and leaves and twigs I found along the border. I know it'll be a very smoky fire, but that's what I'm hoping for. I pile the material into a small mound and arrange the logs around it. I light a bundle of needles with my green Bic and lay them on the mound, which catches fire immediately, flames compelled by the abundant oxygen and fuel to consume. Many settlers and visitors to Catawba lands noted how Catawba people used smoke, both as medicine, but also as a tool of democracy and consensus. As a significant decision was being considered, the present parties would make use of what people called the four-direction pipe. In reality, it's as many directions as you need because the number of directions on the pipe is determined by the number of parties there. And this pipe is like a small bowl, and on the sides it has small holes where you can put a reed straw to it. All of these parties, after they've come to a decision, would take this reed straw and put it to the pipe and inhale the smoke together, hold it in, and then together they would blow it out into the center of this group, where all parties would look upon the smoke and try to understand the messages from it. And from that message, it would be revealed whether or not the current solution was in fact the correct solution. As I'm sitting in this Airbnb, as the fire is gaining strength, I sit down against a rock near the fire and watch as the smoke climbed and looped back on itself, diffusing and concentrating as temperature and wind and density determined its path. I watch the smoky shapes turn and shift, straining to understand what they might mean. That specific knowledge, how the smoke speaks, has been taken from us through a few hundred years of epidemics, dispossession, and colonial assimilation. Well, let me actually qualify that. If the knowledge still exists, it wasn't given to me, but someone else may hold it. There are, after all, more than 3,000 Catawbas in existence, and we are not all the same, and we don't have the same experience. But then again, maybe we do have to relearn that language of smoke from the fire. The smoke continues to rise and rise from the fire pit, making an indirect pathway upwards. In the course of climbing upward, the smoke also takes a steep northward path and unceremoniously, without asking permission, passes over the border to this clearing. Evidently, the smoke is trying to say that it doesn't care about pink flags marking a border or property lines. And if recent years have taught us anything, it's that fire doesn't care about those things either, nor does pollution, nor viruses. warisare, which means disease. In preparing this, I almost didn't write this section because every time I begin to reflect on this past year, as I'm sure many other people feel, I get hyper emotional, and this is supposed to be a lecture, and so I'm not supposed to be emotional. But I contemplate the loss of life so monumental and in such a short period of time that it boggles my senses. But of course, those numbers themselves don't even begin to describe the magnitude of loss that each individual death represents. Almost 600,000, and each of those people being individuals with families and communities. In my tribe, we hold what's called a general council meeting twice a year, in January and then again in June. In the January meeting every year, we typically read off the names of those who have passed on. This year, the list was longer than I'd ever remembered. And when I asked other people, they concurred. The longest list of people who have passed on in living memory, including the death of one of our elected leaders, Butch Sanders, who passed away in November. As he stayed in his hospital bed, his family and other tribal members safely gathered in the parking lot outside of the hotel and drummed and danced to show him that his community was still there with him. Just a few years ago, my sister's name was on that list, Catawba George-Warren, or as we always call her, Casey. On January 21st, 2017, I stood outside the National Museum of the American Indian, listening to the contingent of Indigenous women who had come to the Women's March. While thousands of people milled about, going to hear from the celebrities on the main stage, or simply walking around, holding signs and wearing hats, the cohort of Indigenous women drummed, danced, and spoke powerfully about the ongoing crisis of Indigenous women, girls, and queer people who continue to be kidnapped, killed, or otherwise disappeared from our communities. This is what Nahani Fontaine described as the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG2S. That evening, returning from the protest, the parade, I got a message from my parents saying that my sister was in the emergency room. I wasn't overly concerned since my sister, like many uninsured and underinsured people, relied on emergency rooms as a kind of primary care provider. By that Monday, only 2 days later, she was in a coma with multiple organ failure and experiencing a series of heart attacks. The doctors had to use cold packs along her body to prevent as much damage as possible. Cardiac events occurred repeatedly, and the doctors were doubtful that she would survive the week. I don't know if it was luck, tenacity, or a miracle, but she survived the week. A month later, I borrowed my brother's truck, packed up all the belongings from my tiny, incredibly expensive room in DC, Washington, DC, and drove back to South Carolina to work with my community on our language project, but grateful to be able to spend some time with my sister during her recovery. The biggest regret for me during that time was that I didn't go to the hospital to see her. I've only had terrifying, painful, and sad experiences at hospitals, as I'm sure many other people do. And every time I consider going to see her in the hospital, I could feel my entire body clench. And it felt like someone turned the static way up in my head. But I did get to see my sister during her returns from the hospital. For months, the cycle continued of her being released from the hospital with a huge regimen of drugs and treatments and equipment, only to have to return a week later when the treatments didn't manage her condition. After 9 months of this, in mid-September 2017, early in the morning, I received the call from my parents that she had passed away. I was in DC for a performance, and a few weeks later, we held her memorial service at our cultural center, where a group of Catawba women sang our traditional women's honor song. All told, my sister's care and treatment cost well over $1 million, but thanks to socialized healthcare, our bill costs only a few thousand. But how gross to talk about money in the same story as my sister. But that is the experience of millions and millions and millions of people, weighing cancer treatments because of cost, being offered an older treatment because of the caliber of their insurance, and people having to weigh the need of an ambulance in an emergency with the cost and their bank account. Every day there are stories on social media of people getting Band-Aids at the EAR and receiving a bill for thousands of dollars, a debt that can take literally years to pay off. Disasters happen. Coronavirus was a disaster. Hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, building collapses, viruses. But it is us, the way we structure our society, that turns a disaster into a catastrophe. COVID-19 didn't kill 569,000 people in this country alone. It had help from economic systems that keeps certain workers in constant economic precarity, so that in a disaster, they must still work, must put their family at danger, or face homelessness, starvation, medical crises. The virus was helped by a healthcare system that has been ruled by ideas of efficiency, where extra capacity is considered a waste. The virus was helped by an insurance schema that says simply, if you are wealthy, you have more access and options to treatment and prevention. Literally, if you are wealthy, you have more of a right to life. We don't have to help the virus. We could be helping each other. Now, this goes to stories, right? What are the stories that we tell about ourselves, who we are as a species, the way that we live? And there's an idea that humans are inherently competitive, that given a disaster situation where resources are limited, we will hoard and fight and steal and kill. But Rebecca Solnit, author and historian who has written really beautifully about who we become in crisis, published a book in 2010 entitled Paradise Built in Hell: The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster. And from the opening of the book, she says, who are you? Who are we? In times of crisis, these are life and death questions. Thousands of people survived Hurricane Katrina because grandsons or aunts or neighbors or complete strangers reached out to those in need all through the Gulf Coast. And because an armada of boat owners from surrounding communities and as far away as Texas went into New Orleans to pull stranded people to safety. Katrina was an extreme version of what goes on in many disasters, where how you behave depends on whether you think your neighbors or fellow citizens are a greater threat than the havoc wrought by disaster, or a greater good than the property and houses and stores around you. Here she notes that citizen doesn't mean whether or not you're legally a citizen, just a member of a community. What you believe shapes how you act. How you act results in life or death, for yourself or for others. Like everyday life, but only more so during Katrina or other disasters. In this time full of altruism, from young men who took it upon themselves to supply water, food, diapers, and protection to the strangers stranded with them, to people who sheltered neighbors, to the uncounted hundreds or thousands who set out in boats, armed often, but also armed with compassion, to find those who were stranded in the stagnant waters and bring them to safety. To the 200,000 or more who volunteered to house complete strangers, mostly in their homes, via the internet site hurricanehousing.org in the weeks after. More persuaded by the pictures of suffering than the rumors of monstrosity, to the uncounted tens of thousands of volunteers who came to the Gulf Coast to rebuild and restore. Not 2 weeks after my sister passed away, our representative to Congress, Ralph Norman, who is the 17th richest person in Congress, with more than $18 million in net worth and the recipient of almost $40,000 in campaign contributions from insurance companies, voted to do away with the very healthcare that kept my sister alive for 9 more months and kept my family out of intergenerational debt. Thankfully, Norman's policy of death did not win out in this vote. Now, would Casey still be here if we had a system that understood health as a right, that didn't treat food policy like a race to make it as cheap as possible, that didn't criminalize substance abuse disorders and treat them and their social conditions? Would my sister still be alive if we lived in a social system that saw the death, disappearance, illness, and incarceration of Indigenous women as the ongoing crisis that it is? It's impossible to know, but a brother can definitely dream. Someday I'm gonna live in your house upon the hill. When your skinhead neighbor goes missing, I'll plant a garden in the yard. Then I'm gluing roses on a flatbed. You should see it. I mean thousands. I grew up here till it all went up in flames, except the notches in the door frame. I don't know how, but I'm taller. It must be something in the water. Everything is growing in our garden. You don't have to know that it's haunted. Doctor put her hand over my liver, told me my resentment's getting smaller. No, I'm not afraid of hard work. I get everything I want. I have everything that I wanted. And now we come to the end, or perhaps the beginning, which is also a very good place to start. In the beginning, there were many things on the earth. The things that didn't wander but grew tall into the sky, those that never grew tall but grew beautifully close to the ground, the creatures that crawled on their bellies or flew in the air or ran through the forest. All of the things told stories, the trees through the whispers of their leaves, and the toxins in their husks. Others told stories about eating and being eaten. Others told stories about how even the crap we reject is useful. The earth itself told stories. However, one day, after eons of living this way, one of these animals decided to tell stories to itself. The first story it told was that it had a name, human. The second story it told was that a creature that named itself was no longer an animal. It told itself the story that human was unique, uniquely smart, uniquely gifted, uniquely responsible, and uniquely special. Human whispered into its heart that special things, unique things like it, were allowed to determine everyone else's story. To the things that ran through the woods, it told a new story of living inside of a cage. To the things that swam, it told a story of poisoning rivers. To the things that grew from the earth, it said that they had no story and that they could only exist as resource. Human grew powerful off the meat of the running things and the fruit of the growing things. Human built walls and told a story that everything inside of those walls was like human, unique, powerful, and exceptional. And bereft of their stories, all the other creatures began to leave, sometimes one by one, and other times in great extinction events. And in its loneliness, human kept telling stories about its greatness for so long that it forgot where it came from. Soon all the creatures left, leaving human alone, except for the creatures that human had transformed to fit its needs, the meat animals, the wood trees, the fruit plants. In the end, human destroyed everything, including its own story. In Catawba, the phrase "Dita hida paksure," say it 10 times fast, literally means tell me a story, and it also literally means tell me a lie. And this story that I've just told you is a lie. We've told a story in the US and elsewhere for a long time that there is a nature over there and a humanity over here, a wilderness over there, but a civilization over here, resources out there and progress over here. When explorers came from Europe to visit these lands, they were so overwhelmed by the abundance of life that they described it as a Garden of Eden, their only reference point for something that was so bountiful, so full of life. John Muir and Henry David Thoreau continued that refrain through their praise of natural landscapes and wilderness, prophets of conservation. But this is a lie. The abundant, lively landscape early explorers experienced wasn't the result of a deity placing it upon the earth. What they witness is what happens when humans remember the story that we are a part of this earth. When Thoreau wrote of Walden Pond, the scrubby growth he experienced wasn't just how nature is, how wilderness is. It was the result of concentrating and removing indigenous people in the Northeast so that they could no longer practice traditional landscape-wide management practices. When John Muir saw the Sierra Nevadas and Yosemite Valley, he described them in terms of religious ecstasy. He said, "This is a cathedral of light, but no cathedral made by the hands of man could ever compare to this place." Because of the stories he was told about humanity, he believed that these places needed to be protected from humanity. So in pursuing this goal, he advocated for the exclusion of both indigenous peoples and settlers. And in doing so, he forever changed that landscape from the thing he loved to a place that had lots of dense growth, where the large game animals didn't visit as often because they couldn't move easily through the landscape. Stories have consequences, and we aren't telling the right story. We tell the story that humanity is bad for the world, that our only way to be with the world is destructive and extractive. And maybe, if we're really, really good, then our negative impact would be minimal. What a sad story we're telling ourselves. Let's consider a different story, embodied by indigenous peoples for millennia, that we are a part of this world, that we are nodes in the vast ecology that goes from the deepest roots of trees to the clouds far above our head. Let's tell the story that humanity does have gifts. We can think about the future in a particular way. We can change through culture rapidly, and that we are really, really good at making ecological edges, which tend to be very abundant areas for life. Let's tell the story that we can not only live with the earth without destroying it, but that we can actually work with all the creatures, the ones that grow, the ones that crawl, the ones that swim, the ones that fly, to make a world that is more abundant, more full of life, and more diverse than we can imagine. Let's tell the story that we love the earth, and the earth loves us. Hello to everyone for joining us, and we are now going to go into a Q&A, and we're going to be joined by a wonderful Dartmouth student, Ana Furtado, who will be leading us during this Q&A.
Hello. Thank you, Rue. Thank you for everyone for joining us today and watching this incredible performance. So as Rue has just said, we're going to be jumping into a Q&A session. So feel free to drop your questions. I encourage you all that are watching us today to drop in your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them. But yes, I would love to begin the conversation with Rue and start by saying thank you so much for the incredible performance. It was just wonderful for me. I'm pretty sure everyone in the audience to watch and learn from you. And I know that we don't have too much time. I could, sit here and just like talk to you forever. But I guess one of the first things for us to start the conversation is perhaps people who may not know you yet, will be not surprised to find out that besides an amazing performance and an artist and a storyteller, you also work with a number of different projects that, intertwine language reclamation, educational sovereignty, and questions of food system revitalization, and how that works not only for, but with, in collaboration with the Catawba Nation. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work outside the artistic world, as well as how that intertwines with, your performance, such as the one that you showed us today.
Yeah, thank you. So I graduated with a degree in musical arts, opera, and composition. And after graduating, moved to DC to change the world and realize that's not really what happens in DC. And so in 2017, like I mentioned in the piece, I had the opportunity to move back home thanks to a grant from this organization called Running Strong for American Indian Youth. And my job was to make a language app for our language project. So coming back, of course, I kind of dove into the language, looking through our massive dictionary, which is sitting here next to me, always next to this table. And what I realized really rapidly was that language is a system of knowledge that comes about in a specific context, in a specific place. And so much of the knowledge in our language is about our world that we live in. As Catawba people, who we are as Catawba came about on these lands. And so our language really reflects that. So I realized I couldn't really get the language or understand the language unless I was learning also about the things that grow and the things that run and the things that fly. For example, I talked a little bit about this contrast between nature and civilization, kind of this classic Western dichotomy. And just as an example of how it is really an artificial, idea of a specific culture, is that in Catawba, the word nature doesn't exist, right? Because what are you talking about? Are you talking about the things literally outside the walls? So just outside is what you're trying to describe, right? And so that's kind of how I got into working on food sovereignty stuff, was through the language. I'm now very blessed to be able to work for the tribe as a consultant. So I actually am not the main person working on these things, but I get to step in and help on various projects. One project I'm very excited about right now is working with our 0 to 1 classroom in our childcare. So very, very tiny little babies, and figuring out how do you teach culture and language to little infants? And the answer we found was music. So I finally got to use my fancy opera degree and composition degree to make fun little nursery songs for our kids that actually teaches them grammar in it, right? Some of them, they conjugate verbs. Another one, they use different words to identify things. So yeah.
Yeah, I love how interdisciplinary your work is as well, because as I was watching it, I felt like I was, in a classroom and really engaging with all these different materials that stem from biology, but also sustainability, and questions of, Native American nations, and, gaining all this information through performance. So I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about how did you first get involved in the performative world, and, why do you believe that was, or when did you realize that was a way to communicate your ideas and communicate, issues that were precious to you and should be precious to everyone?
Oh my gosh, such a good question. Well, first off, I have a lot of anxiety in general, particularly social anxiety, and which you might not guess based on how I'm interacting now. But my parents always said Rue doesn't like people; he just likes audiences. And for a while, I was oh, so I'm just oh, they're just making fun of me, they're saying I'm proud. But I realized I really do like that dynamic because when you're on stage, the script is very clear. I know what I'm doing when I get up there. I know I'm going to walk on stage, do something weird. Everyone else is going to sit there quietly till I end, and then they're going to clap, and then we might do something afterwards. So like the script is very clear. But when I'm like interacting one-on-one with people, or like particularly when I was a kid, having to go and ask a store clerk for something, for example, filled me with dread because I'm like, what do I do with my hands, right? So I've always viewed society, like interpersonal relationships, as following scripts that sometimes felt hard for me to understand, particularly as a queer person growing up, like the script that as a boy I need to be playing sports, even though I did not get it and didn't like competition and didn't like physical exertion. And so I think I ended up going into the fine arts because it was the place where I could make and create and wonder without boundaries. Whereas in the other fields, like I was also always really into science, like really into science. But it felt very much like, okay, well, you need to learn all this, and then maybe one day you can get creative with it or like thoughtful with it. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of why I got into that. I realized quickly that opera has a very specific and limited idea of what like a good performance is. And like, what was weird about it is I'm coming from a tribe where our vocal technique, for example, in drumming, does not sound like opera technique, right? And so I was being in a place where it was like expected that I was supposed to view this opera technique as being more legitimate. So that's what led me into thinking more about performance art, where I could be a lot broader with what my materials are. And then in DC, I did some work there as well. But now in my work today, I really see, I really try and think about like, okay, I'm having a meeting with all of these stakeholders. How can I write an agenda, a script, for example, that'll get us to past the barriers that we put up, whether or not it's like bad experiences in the past that people have had in that group, for example. How can we just move forward and start talking together and think about the future? I think I'm most motivated by curiosity and what's possible. And so I think my frustration has always been like, how do I get this thing that I see in my head of just like a really beautiful, abundant earth, like into other people's heads? And I don't know, it's something I'm still trying to figure out through things like these performances and this talk.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's just fascinating to hear how, the creative process behind it as well. So I think that we can move on to, we have one comment and question from the audience. So this person says, this performance had such cool tech and digital effects. Is there a version of it that's live, or was it always created for a virtual performance? How do you do all the wizardry? That's a good question.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, so this is an extension of, so I've had a few different like series of performances. One piece, which was actually what I was supposed to originally do with Dartmouth before COVID, the Hopkins Center, is called the Indigenous Corps of Discovery, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference back to the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was officially called the Corps of Discovery. Because when I moved to DC, I went to all the museums, and what I was shocked about was at the Presidential Portrait Gallery, almost no mention of Native Americans, despite the fact that every single president up until, Woodrow Wilson had to have as a centerpiece of their policy Native American affairs. And so like, why are we erased from that area? So leading up to the election in 2016, I did a series of tours of these presidential portrait galleries where I'm like talking about this jerk did this jerk did this, blah, blah, blah. And that was funded through an amazing organization called Humanity in Action. And so that's been one that I've been doing for a long time. And I was really hoping I'd be able to do it at the Hopkins Center. I also did it at the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. Mm-hmm. But this is more in line with a series of performances I've done that I'm calling lecture operas. I'm still trying to figure out what they are, but I think what I'm playing with is like, in college, I was a tour guide. And we did these exercises like, what is your best? Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Like, how do we, like, they were asking in this tour guide training, like, what's your superpower as a tour guide? And I was like, I don't know. I just have a deep voice that's very resonant. And so people think I'm telling the truth all the time. And so I'm like trying to play with like, who do we believe when they say things? based on like, I'm someone who looks white, I have a deep voice, I'm male gendered. Like people see me all the time and are like, oh, this person knows what he's talking about, even if I have no idea what I'm talking about. And so in this format, I'm trying to look at like, where are the lines between fiction and reality? Who do we view as like the person who can say the real versus the unreal? This is the most technically advanced version of this performance I've ever done, because I was like, usually I'm on stage and I'm like, move about a lot more, but in this space, I'm like here. And so how can I make this space bigger than what it is? So just on a technical side, I've used OBS, which is a free and open source software. I encourage everyone to look into it if they're interested in doing this stuff. And yeah, just played around. I was always the kid in school that would like make over the top PowerPoints, you know? And so that's just come into my modern day art practice.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's fascinating to hear, because I took one class here at Dartmouth, which was interesting, which was media and the activist Amazon. It was just amazing to learn about how, media can help us really change the way we think about these social issues and the way we think about certain aspects of life that, become so trivial. And then, introducing media in a certain way, you actually learn how to tackle it from, a different perspective. So I guess that we have time for just one more question, which I think that I'll take this opportunity to ask. If you can briefly mention how your experience as a Native artist performing to, primarily non-Native audiences, what does that interaction look like? And, how you're rewriting these spaces in which you're entering through your own perspective and by, privileging, or not privileging, like centering these narratives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was something that really came to the forefront for me in doing the Indigenous Core of Discovery tours. Was like, it was inescapable after like the first week or two. Like, only non-Native people are coming to this, which there's a statistical part to that, but also like, I started thinking, I was like, okay, well, I'm mostly just talking about the history of United States policies with tribal nations, and that's not a positive history. And like, if I'm trying to spend my evening, I'm not like trying to go down the road of like trauma, just like enjoying that trauma. And so that really set me on a road of like, okay, what do I need to be doing? I think there's two pieces to this. On one hand, the reactions I got from non-Native people on this tour were almost universally like, I didn't know, like, and like angry about their upbringing, that this was not something that they were taught. Because once you hear it, you're like, of course, that's the only like story that kind of makes sense. And so, on that end, I was like, well, it does seem like this work needs to be necessary. And also as someone who's like very privileged within Native communities, because I'm coded as white and cisgender man and like got an education at Catawba University, like, I feel like that's also the kind of educational labor that I can take on, of being like, I'll answer the really annoying questions that you're going to ask that I've heard 7,000 times during my life. And try and get it towards a place of being like, now you've heard my answer to it, and I'm just one person with one very specific experience in Indian country. You need to now go out and do listen to other people. And when Will mentioned Jamie Powell, who's at Dartmouth, is an amazing, amazing curator and thinker, and particularly helped me rethink this part of my art practice, in that there's been a lot of precedent for Indigenous people intervening in institutions. Like James Luna, for example, has this famous performance art piece where he literally strips down to basically just his underwear and then lies in the museum, kind of drawing attention to the fact that Natives are only represented as in the past and dead in museums. So there's a long history of institutional critique coming from Native people, feminist critics, and others. And so what I love about what Jamie Powell's thinking about is how do we just go past that, like, using the detritus of colonialism and just make our own spaces, make our own creative spaces. And that's the work that's been really nurturing to me coming back to my community, is like creating in a way that I'm not creating to be understood by other people, but creating a way to build community, communicate with other citizens, and have a fun time singing with little toddlers.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Rue. I think we're out of time, but I wanted to, is there anything else that you would like to say before we leave, unfortunately?
No, hawo, Anna, and hawo to the entire Hopkins team. This was a really wonderful performance, and with lots of technical advances. And so I really appreciate all the patience and support. And I love talking to a class earlier this week. Excited to talk to another class tomorrow. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ruth. Thank you so much for the performance, and thank you all for joining us tonight. And yes, we will leave you here.
Hawo.